Welcome to Greek for a Week. We are looking at the second part of this particular paragraph, which, if you recall, was chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. So this week we're looking at 9 through 12 in a diagram form. Again, the purpose of this diagram is to not only show what it is that Paul is saying, but how Paul is structuring things together so that we can have a better understanding. I guess probably to answer two questions, we can get an understanding as to how and why. How did Paul put it together, and why was it put together that way? So if we look at the text for verses 9 through 12, we can see that we begin verse 9 with agar, which ultimately means that there's some kind of a relationship to what precedes it. So we'll look at that. Then again, as we move our way forward in the text, you're going to notice that he's asking them to recall or remember something about, again, what was stated prior to these particular verses. Then you also have oidate, which is, again, Paul is basically helping them recall or state to them, you know something about our ministry to you, the Thessalonians. So let's go forward and just take a look, because I've included verses 7 and 8 just to kind of bring us up to speed as far as the context is concerned. If you recall in verse 7, he was again talking about, I have manner here. He was talking about the manner in which he approached them, how he ministered to them. Again, he says, we were gentle among you. And then he says, basically, while that affection for you was taking place, what happened? Where basically we shared the gospel of God to you. And the reason for sharing, the reason for the way that we ministered and handled you all is because you became very dear to us. So as Paul wraps up really those top 8 verses of 1 through 12, let me bring in verse 9. So he says, for you remember, brethren, our labor and hardship while working night and day. So I'm suggesting that's a temporal participle there. So he is, again, expressing the conditions to his ministry to the church at Thessalonica. That is, I worked night and day. I labored hard on behalf of you. Again, so that you have a purpose clause here, pros, ta plus the infinitive. You have a purpose clause to say, I did not want to be a burden to any of you. That's the reason for me working night and day. We proclaimed to you the gospel of God. Again, so we're back to this gospel of God. This is where Paul, again, is expressing not only the how and the why and the when of his ministry, but most importantly, what was his ministry? His ministry was preaching the gospel of God, really going all the way back to verse 1, and that's going to carry through verse 12 to where we will see on the next slide the overall purpose for the proclamation of the gospel. Then he begins in verse 10 here. He says, you yourselves, so humes is involved here, an emphatic pronoun. You yourselves are witnesses, and so is God. Now he's going to express the manner in which he ministered to them, how devoutly, uprightly, and blamelessly we were to you, the believers. So those are all adverbs of manner with the use of the ly here. So you were witnesses to how we were to you as believers, just as you know. So the you is the same here. You yourselves you're witnesses, but you also know. What is it that you know? You know how we were exhorting you. So there's a participle of manner. And encouraging and testifying to each of you. So you have the concept here of manner, how it was that we came alongside of you as a father does to his children. Overall purpose. Ace, ta, plus the infinitive right here. Overall purpose is so that you would walk worthy of God. And then he gives us an expression of who God is. He's the one who called you, attributive participle, into, and I would say that use of ace here, this whole prepositional phrase, is purpose or goal. He's the one who called you for the purpose of, or for the goal of, being in his kingdom and his glory. Kind of a cool way to end this particular paragraph, to know the goal of God and to be a part of that as a believer. So I'm going to use the gar here. Paul's a further explanation while preaching. I still believe the while preaching goes back to verse 1, where in verse 1 and 2, where he talked about preaching the gospel and how he and his co-workers, co-laborers, they were examined, continually examined by God, but yet they were also approved by God to do what? And that is to preach the gospel. So his further explanation in verses 9 through 12, he has a testimony of his labor. Well, he talked about his work night and day. And then the purpose of his work is, I did not want to be a burden to any of you. Then the testimony of his character, here his character, he talks about devoutly and basically how and justly his character was on par. You could say the character of the messenger, okay, very much matched the character of the message. Then you have his instruction there that he encouraged and he admonished as a father does his children. You could almost kind of break it down in two different ways like this. We proclaimed the gospel of God. So verse 9 indicates this is what Paul did, and this is why Paul did it. Paul did it for the purpose of walking worthy of God. And the only way to walk worthy of God is to preach the gospel of God and accept that message. So I think Paul's overall intent here of the entire paragraph is proclamation so that we could ultimately fulfill a purpose. Trust this has been helpful. We'll start the next paragraph, verse 13 next week. Have a great week.